to an hour lunch and learn. I appreciate everyone taking the opportunity or using their lunch hour to sort of participate in this presentation. I wanted to first say that there may be some technical issues. So I'm going to say I'm asking everyone to be sort of nimble about that. As with any presentation, I think the difficulty with a lot of the virtual is that you never know what's going to happen with the tech. So my hope is that I can go through this presentation without having any technical difficulties. But Tamika and Laura, I will be leaning on both of you very heavily. So thank you guys for supporting me. In terms of trying to decide for a topic today, I wanted to do education. And as I was brainstorming what to talk about, education is a very large topic area. And so I was trying to hone in on what can I speak to in terms of my experience or something I think has been on the news recently that has affected children and teachers and the system generally. And so what I ended up deciding on is focusing on two major players, role models, if you will, of the educational system: teachers and school resource officers, which I'm going to sort of use interchangeably with cops, right? Cops in schools, both of whom I think have significant influences on our students on a daily basis, as they are the ones being exposed to them, daily and workly. And, I think both have very difficult jobs to do. But within that, I wanted to explore this topic area, really looking at it from a racial justice lens. And when you talk about racial justice, you're really talking about anytime you do work with race and ethnic disparity reduction, you're looking at really three things: the overrepresentation of youth of color in the system, you're looking at the disparate treatment of youth in the system, and the unnecessary movement of youth of color in the juvenile justice system or the educational system for that matter. I think for me, as I sort of venture to sort of discuss what my perspective is, and I have to admit right from the door, right from the beginning, is that my perspective is that of an advocate. My perspective is that of someone who has dealt with teachers, who has dealt with administrators, who has represented these young students in administrative proceedings or in court proceedings. So I'm going to speak really, or my hope is to speak firsthand sort of about information or experiences that I've been able to sort of garner in the long time that I've been doing this type of work. And it's the type of work I think that drives me, the type of work that I think is something I'm committed to. Particularly when we talk about the unnecessary harsh school discipline and the arrests that are being made, not just in Pennsylvania, across the nation. I can speak to having done this type of work in two states, in Pennsylvania and in Connecticut. And so I want to start off by sort of setting the stage of that, I've had to represent students, and I've had to represent particularly an Afro-Latino student, an 11-year-old student who was suspended and criminally charged essentially for a pushing and shoving match. This person had no prior discipline. And as it turned out, as I investigated the case, it was someone who was bullied and basically responded. But I think when I really evaluate a case like that and I talk to the family, I'm asking myself, how does this happen in Pennsylvania? How does that happen that we have a system that's set up that I'm speaking to an Afro-Latino student who's having problems, and explain to the parents now how the system is set up, what needs to happen, what needs to be done. And more importantly, my daughter at the time was 11-year-old at the time as well. And I was sort of asking myself, this is really bizarre that this happens daily in Pennsylvania, in Dauphin County, in Philadelphia, and across the nation. I have to ask myself, how do I prepare this 11-year-old to testify at a district judge hearing? How do I explain to this 11-year-old, hey, I know this is your first run-in, and in my estimation, I think it was something that was sort of blown out of proportion, but this is the system that we have set up. I then asked myself, what are the emotional scars to this young student, the student of color? I can say that with certainty, studies after studies show that once a child touches the juvenile justice system, they're drawn and pushed into the system. And these types of stories or these types of incidents really speaks to how the child is being handled by an administrator, by a teacher, by a school resource officer. And so these are the kinds of cases I think that really frustrate me, that really sort of at its core should affect all of us as a parent, educator, attorney, social worker. We all have friends, we all have families, we all have children, and children are our future. And with that as sort of the sort of foundational platform, I think we should all care about what happens to our children in the educational system. I had a 15-year-old Asian student that I represented at expulsion hearing. And within that expulsion hearing, the school administrator of the school was seeking to expel this young student for conduct that happened outside of school property. And again, I'm sort of shaking my head and saying, how does this happen? How is it a 15-year-old is going to be facing expulsion when he has excellent grades? An incident that happened, in my estimation, outside of school property that's not really affecting the educational environment. And how is it that I have to now deal with an administrator that my client has said, hey, the teachers don't like the way I look. The teachers treat me differently. The administrator in the school has been gunning for me, has been trying to kind of watching every step I make. And to that, I go to this expulsion hearing and I am trying to speak to the administrator about resolving this case because I'm thinking, man, this kid's had a few hiccups, no really serious disciplinary issues, had excellent grades, and sort of trying to figure out a way in which we can resolve this matter. I'm a firm believer that you seek the path of least resistance when you can, and when you can't, I think you do what's necessary to be an advocate and to push for the cause. And it was apparent to me as I was speaking to this administrator, who, incidentally was a white administrator, it was obvious to me, it was apparent to me that this particular administrator did not care about what I was saying or what the points I was highlighting. I could feel the racial animus. I could feel that he was saying to me, or not saying, he did say to me, hey, Mr. Rivera, I understand what you're saying, and we believe that he should study, and we believe he should be in school, but we don't believe he should be in this school. And so it was easy for me at that point to say to the hearing, the hearing examiner, the hearing officer that we were in front of, like, hey, I think this is going to be a hearing. And so was one of those cases that after the expulsion proceeding, we had the hearing examiner rule in our favor and agree to admit the child back into school immediately. But it's one of those things. I read the Kid or Riot Act. You have to walk a straight line. You have to be careful. If in fact you believe what you believe, and I have no reason to question you, particularly after speaking to the administrator, you have to walk a fine line. You have to do what's necessary because oftentimes, unfortunately, the bar is set higher, or things are perceived differently when you're of a different race, a different ethnicity, a different nationality. Interestingly enough, for that case, we had this young student readmitted to school. Got a call from his dad, and 3 days later, he was suspended for a minor infraction. But all this is to say that I want to use that as a sort of a springboard to explore, consistent with the topic, is who's teaching our children, which students are being affected most, and what impact the school resource officers have on the student's educational process. So my hope is to hit those subject areas in the short time that I have today for this Lunch and Learn. I can tell you before we look at some of the data and some of what the composition of the school teachers and SROs look like, I want to say that in my estimation, I think it's inescapable, or rather, the inescapable conclusion I come with is that sometimes, not all the times, but oftentimes, teachers and school resource officers contribute to the unnecessary harsh school discipline, truancy, and arrest of these young kids of color. So we take a look now at what our teachers look like, and I'm going to give credit where credit's due. A lot of this is not my research. This is data that I gleaned from reading articles and looking at the State Department of Ed website. And I know that there was an article on Penn Live about a year ago that did an excellent, thorough sort of data point on where we are in Pennsylvania, what the stats look like. And I know there was a recent article that our executive director came out and that also spoke to some of this data as well. But I think it's worth mentioning, more than 95% of Pennsylvania teachers are white. More than 50% of our schools in Pennsylvania have no teachers of color. Men of color account for a dismal 1% of all teachers in Pennsylvania. Our former Secretary of Education, Pedro Rivera, no relationship to me, although I would have met Mr. Rivera, openly said that our state's roster of teachers was the least diverse in the nation. And by all means, this is no way, I want to be clear that I'm not indicting teachers, I'm not indicting SROs, I'm making observations from the data, from my experience, from what I've been able to see. Some articles speak to the diversity among teachers in Pennsylvania hasn't improved not even 1% in the last 7 academic years. And I think when we look at that, we have to ask ourselves, well, what does that mean? When we start digging in deeper and we're sort of trying to figure out why are all these racial incidents happening in the schools, right? What's happening? Why are we having stereotypes? Why are we having this unconscious bias? Why are we having marks of racism and discrimination? And I would argue that the lack of diversity contributes to that. And this lack of diversity hurts students and the schools, and it impacts students' achievement. It negatively impacts their achievement, their graduation, truancy rates. Now, I often get the question, well, how does the truancy rate really get affected? Well, when you have a child who's suspended or faces school-based arrest, that child is no longer participating in the educational system. That child, I would hazard a guess, now has to find a way to occupy his or her time. That child invariably will find, unfortunately, bad ways to occupy that time. And so as a result, it's a perpetual cycle. I think it's obvious, I think, in my estimation, that students of color need role models. They need role models, figures of authority that one can either look like them or can relate to them or can really have that sort of cultural competence to be able to speak to them, right? And have sort of a diverse background. I think when we don't have diversity within teachers, our educators, the key person that school children are being influenced and conditioned and molded, that it's important to have that. I think we're missing that connection. And when I say we're missing that connection, I'm not speaking just to kids of color. I think white students also benefit from that, right? Because they can see, oh yeah, they're also people of different backgrounds, of different racial composition that occupy this same realm, that they're educators, they're administrators, they're school resource officers, right? So they can then look to people and say, okay, yeah, I know if I have a complaint about the way I'm being treated or the way I'm being mistreated, that person's gonna listen to me and respond to my needs, respond to what I'm talking about. It was a Johns Hopkins University article or a study that said Black students who had at least one Black teacher in elementary school were more likely to graduate high school and consider college. So just think of that one statistic or that one data point. I can share that I came from an inner city school where the population of my school was 45% Hispanic, 45% African American, and the rest were either Caucasian, Asians, or a very small group of other students. My time in high school, I didn't run into a single Hispanic or Latino teacher or educator, a single Latino or African American administrator. I know the school had in some of its sporting, like the football coach may have been African American, the baseball coach may have been Hispanic, but I'm talking about the educators that are in the classrooms day in and day out. They were very few and far between. And I think the reason this becomes critically important is that we have to ask ourselves, how do we create a rich and diverse environment for these students, right? Particularly when you have very few students of color, right? How do you capture, how do you sort of entice, or how do you draw in the student to really, one, understand and appreciate the lecture, understand that they are as much of this learning process, they're as much of the learning experience. I think we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. I think we give a lot of lip service to those three things. I think the data here is reprehensible. And when I look at that, I'm like, wow. So really, in the last 7 years, we haven't been able to sort of move the needle on this. And I know this is going to be a topic that stirs debate, that stirs sort of the back and forth, which I understand. And again, I am giving my perspective from that of an advocate and having been in the front lines. And so I understand that we have to recognize the importance of having diverse educators. We have to understand and appreciate possessing cultural competence. We have to have things continual, I think, training with teachers and administrators about implicit bias and how we perceive and see the world. We need to change our curriculum to include more diversity, more history. It's nice to have Black History Month. It's nice to have Hispanic Awareness of Cultural Month too. But all of this is our history, American history. And I think all that should be embedded so that these students get from history, understand the rich history that we have, and it's all of our history. I think we're all inextricably bound to one another. And when you think about it, students are our futures, right? They're going to be the future educators, the future politicians, the future mayors, the future chiefs of police, right? And so we all need to be mindful of those kinds of things because that has a strong imprint on what we do. And when I talk about cultural competence, I think and based on my experience, we're talking about a lot of different things, right? So in school, a teacher, in my estimation, like a law enforcement officer, I did a lot of criminal defense work, and I would often say that the person that holds the most power in the criminal justice system is a police officer, because it is he or she that sets the system in motion. And it's hard to push back and stop that motion once it starts moving. I think analogous to that is the teacher, right? It's the teacher that makes certain decisions about discipline, about school-based arrests, that puts that same system in motion. And it's hard, it's extremely difficult to stop that. And so you may be in a school where it could be heavily populated by children or youth of color. It may not be, but the reality is that oftentimes data shows that when you have a discipline issue, a white teacher is likely to give a white student a pass. Say, hey, Johnny, sit in your seat. I'm going to have to call your mom this afternoon or your dad. And that may be the only discipline that student receives. When you talk about kids of color, oftentimes it's just the opposite. There's this perception of the kid being a nuisance, or the kid being a problem child, or the kid being violent. And so they don't get that same pass. They're like, hey, they're going to resort to either sending the kid to the office, calling a security guard or the school resource officer, or getting an administrator involved in something that really is misbehavior. And so this next video is to show you, or to sort of demonstrate what I'm talking about, right? When you don't have the cultural awareness, when you don't have training on implicit bias, you have these kinds of things that happen at school. I'm hoping this works.
Samuel, do you know we can't hear this?
Can people hear this video or no?
No.
We can. I believe those of us in the Commonwealth
can.
system can.
Yes.
If you're using your state issued laptop, you may be having some difficulty with it.
Tamika, this is Desiree. I'm on my work laptop and I'm able to hear it with no problem.
Yeah,
Me too.
This is Lyle, and I could hear it very well. This
All
is
right.
Keith, the same.
Okay, so I think,
I can't hear anything.
all right, so
I put the closed caption on at the bottom. There should be a closed caption option on your system at the bottom. So if you can't hear it, if you click closed caption, you can listen as you're going along. And if Chief Counsel doesn't have any objection, perhaps we can share the presentation with the staff afterwards if you can watch the video at your leisure.
yeah, and again, I apologize for the tech issue. I think consistent with what Tamika just said, we can make the PowerPoint available to the folks that want it. We're gonna hit the closed caption is on there. I will take a minute or two sort of to sum up what the video shows for those of us who didn't have the benefit of hearing it, but I'm gonna continue to play the video. After it's done, I'm gonna try to summarize what was spoken on this video and what's the takeaway. So you guys can indulge me. And I apologize for the tech issue. So I want to just summarize. I just showed a video, and to be honest with you, it's a video I expected to see back in 1960s, 1970s, not last week. I mean, this is clearly an area school in Pittsburgh where the teacher assigned, the assignment was focused on slave trade, and it called for the students to basically imagine themselves being a retired captain and being a slave trader, and they would sort of use, it was clearly a math problem if you ask me, but it was clearly offensive, and I don't know what to say. I mean, other than they were tasked, the students were tasked to imagine being a slave trader and to sort of market or figure out its profitability to have, with slaves, African Americans. And so, I mean, I think it's deplorable. I think, and look, I know that part of the art, for those who weren't able to hear, that teacher was suspended, and the school says that it's no longer going to be playing that. But I'll be honest with you, I'm not going to blame just solely the teacher. I think the student had it right. So there were a few students that spoke, and their parents saying how uncomfortable, how insensitive that is to have such an assignment like that. And especially in 2021, in the wake of all the social upheaval and all the different things that have been going on in the United States and around the world, it just doesn't make sense to me. And so, you know, how do you explain that, right? And so to me, it's just confusing. I mean, how we condition our students is this clear example of not having, I think, which is an obvious social awareness on what's appropriate and what's not, especially coming from an educator. But I put the blame too on the administrators and the people who are supposed to be overseeing the curriculum and knowing what these kids are being taught. And so, again, to underscore my point is that we should have, it's critically important, right, to have this cultural diversity in our schools, to have, I mean, even if we're going to have white teachers, that at least they possess the cultural sensitivity. I'm fully aware, especially in inner city and urban school settings, that a lot of those teachers do not live in that district. But those teachers come from surrounding districts to come in and teach. And quite honestly, with, you know, based on my experience, some of them, you know, are there just to do a job, and some do not care. And I'm not saying this tongue in cheek. I mean, I have, you know, my niece is a teacher, my sister-in-law is a teacher. I have family in law enforcement. I'm just calling the facts as they are. I'm calling it like I see it. So the next video, for those of you who are going to be able to hear it, is a video in which it kind of cuts to why these connections are important and why things happen the way they do. And so this is more of a video than it is audio. So I apologize for those who can't hear the video. So I use that video to kind of offset what we just saw, right? When you have teachers, and am I suggesting that every teacher has to high five their students when they come in? No, but what I am suggesting is that this is a clear example of how you try to engage the youth, how you have that sort of situational awareness to sort of draw in the kid, encourage them to be in class, encourage them to learn. And we just saw Mr. Barry White, not the singer, but we saw Mr. Barry White, the fifth grade teacher who, as I was reading, has that same ritual, that same practice with all his fifth grade students. And so we didn't see them all. I think he has up to 50 or 60 fifth grade students that he does that daily greeting. And I've read articles in which he has said that, you know, you want to set the tone, you want to set the atmosphere in which the kid wants to feel involved, the kid wants to feel engaged, the student wants to be there, ready to learn. And I'm suggesting that these are the kinds of things we have to think about. We have to start thinking innovative. We have to start thinking about doing things out of the box if we want to make change or affect change. So I'm going to now turn my attention to SROs, school resource officers. Whoops. And school resource officers, and I'm going to use this term interchangeably. Some may agree, some may disagree, but I mean, we're talking about cops in schools, right? And so honestly, I didn't know what a school resource officer was. The first time I heard it and people were using the abbreviation SROs, I was like, what's that? What's that? I mean, really, it's a law enforcement person who's in schools, who's basically patrolling the school, who's deputized, who's typically will have a badge, a weapon, and has all the authority to make arrests and all the policing responsibilities you would expect to see in law enforcement. So really we saw when we're talking about school resource officers, I understand historically they've been around for a long time. I was shocked to find that Pennsylvania has a school resource officer organization. Apparently there's a national school resource officer organization as well. But we really started seeing a push to school resource officers after there was the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary shooting in Connecticut. Another horrible situation and circumstance in which 26 people were killed, 20 of which were young students, really young students. And I'm sure a lot of you remember that. I certainly remember that. It was heart-wrenching, and it's still heart-wrenching to think. But legislators moved into action, swift action. And so what ended up happening is a number of states passed laws that required police presence in every school. And I get that. I understand that. And I think the goal at the time was you want to ensure, and I got this from some of the websites from the school resource officers, like what's their mission or what's their overall objective. And so that's where I got these sort of three main points, and I'm sort of paraphrasing them. But one is to ensure the safety of our students. And I think we would all agree, we want that, right? We want to be able to sort of curb school violence or having people go in there and cause harm to our children, you know, our most vulnerable. And I get that. And school resource officers, I understand, serve as mentors, right? Sort of modeling, showing kids, you know, respect for authority and all the things that you expect to go with that. And the third prong is that it prepares our youth, right? It prepares our youth in terms of, you know, again, modeling and doing what's right. But I think that theoretically, all that makes sense. But in reality, it doesn't work. Whatever happened to the good old, and I may be dating myself, and what happened to the good old fashioned hall monitors? Have we gone so far, lost sight of what's going on, that we're now thinking, hey, we need to have police monitoring our schools, influencing our young kids, right? And I think the compromise is that I ask myself, you know, what psychological impact is this having to the students? These kids are going to school. And I know because I've gone to these schools. And when you go to these urban centers or you go to these inner city schools, it's deplorable. You go in there, and the first thing you have to do, whether or not you're a student or teacher, you got to go through a metal detector. Once you get to the metal detector, if there's anything that bings or dings, then you're going to be scanned manually by a wand, another metal detector. Once you get into school, then there's a strong police presence. I went into one school on an administrative matter that I was taken into the administrator's office, and then I took a right-hand turn, and when I looked, it almost looked like a police department. It had cameras everywhere. You had, I mean, it was just amazing to me to see that. And I think as I see this and I experience this, I sort of asked myself, I said, look, I said, all these things in my estimation have the marks, the hallmarks of a prison, a penal institution. And I've been to many county prisons, state penitentiaries, federal penitentiaries. And to me, it's inescapable, the feeling you get when you're in that environment. I can't imagine, I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a sociologist, but I can tell you that has to do something to the human psyche, the psyche of these young children walking into these environments. And then they're expected to behave. They're expected to do all the things they're supposed to be doing without worrying about all the things around them, all the things that they've been exposed to right from the door. So I believe that SROs, school resource officers, when you have cops and you have untrained teachers, that this is a bad combination. This is a combination that has, I think, detrimental effects on students. I think it's a combination that promotes unnecessary, harsh school discipline, truancy, and school-based arrests. And I think this is done in large part because when you start looking at some of the issues, and I've gotten this through talking to SROs and talking to law enforcement officers and being there and representing kids and trying to wrap my hands around this madness, that we get this blurring, right, of aberrant behavior, misbehavior, or adolescent misbehavior, right, versus criminal conduct. We have just effectively blurred that line. And it's the ease in which teachers can now call the police, pull the cop and say, hey, come here, Sam Jr. there, He's acting like a fool. I need you to arrest him. I need you to get him out of here. But I'm not going to put the blame solely on the SROs, because I mean, there's some school resource officers, some cops that actually get it, that have the cultural competence, that have the cultural experience to know what's going on. And I've had them complain to me, Sam, we get calls all the time to go out there about school-related matters. They're really school discipline issues. We shouldn't be out there except in extreme circumstances. And so when you have the blurring of these lines, misbehavior now is being criminalized, right? And so when you have SROs who are actually confirming that, you're sort of questioning why this is happening. But in the end, my takeaway is that students of color are being subjected to push out. They're being pushed out of schools. They're being pushed into the juvenile justice system. They're being pulled into the criminal justice system. And I think unnecessarily. Now, are there circumstances in which you want to respond? Certainly there is. If there's a child that brings a weapon in, there's a child who makes a credible threat. I think all that is worthy of having cops respond and go in. I think for me, the more insidious effect of having police in schools. This is a data set. This data set, it's a few years old, but I suspect in light of COVID, these numbers have changed somewhat, but I imagine not drastically. But the data set I want to hone in is that this is with a compromise, right? We get school safety, right? And this is what we get. We get 70% of all school-based arrests or referrals to law enforcement being Black and Latino students. That's the effect of having that combination. And I think we need to address that. I think these are the things that have to be top priorities for all of us involved in saying all of us involved in life, but even we all have family and kids and cousins and know of youth and young students, that this affects all of us. And this is something that should be important to us, because really in the drive to create public safety, look where the pendulum has swung, right? And then you get even more egregious examples. We have a 6-year-old arrested, right? I think maybe many of you have seen this video. I saw this some time ago, but this is a video. I wish I could say it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It was a video, I think in 2019. It's a 2015 video to show some of the egregious examples of what's happened, how I think we have just kind of, sunk into a new low. I mean, this is the reality that we're dealing with, right? And this is one video. I'm sure if you do a Google search or an internet search and find out about kids being arrested, I'm sure you would find a plethora of or numerous examples of other students being arrested. So I want to play this. And again, I apologize for those who can't hear this video. I will try to summarize once the video is over, and I'm trying to keep track of my time here. And for those of you who couldn't see the video, essentially there was a video of a 6-year-old, I think first grader, was being arrested. I mean, really, this is what we've come down to. I mean, and this is apparently, as I read the news report, is that it was a 6-year-old who kicked or pushed or did something to 3 staff members. I suspect they were not probably injured, and I suspect that this was something that we could have had different approaches in handling. And just imagine, I can't even imagine, and I'll be honest with you, it's hard not to get emotional. If someone did that to my 6-year-old son or daughter, I would, I don't even know how I would respond to that. I mean, I could begin to imagine the emotional scars that that's created for the 6-year-old and their family, and what's happening, how you resolve that. And so these are examples, in my estimation, that aren't isolated, right? Because, I know the pushback I normally get, say, hey, Sam, but those are extreme examples, that really doesn't happen. And so I had a good friend, good colleague of mine when I was working in Connecticut not so long ago, less than 2 years ago, whose 10-year-old son, same thing. He was misbehaving. Police were called, put in a police cruiser. And she remarked to me, Sam, I was lucky because my kid wasn't in an inner city urban school. So rather than sending him to a juvenile detention center, they sent him to the hospital. So apparently he needed some treatment. And these are the kinds of things that we're talking about. These are the kinds of things I think, in my estimation, we really need to look at. But I think there's some good news in the horizon. I think there's been a push now, particularly in light of the George Floyd murder. Other states, including Massachusetts, have passed legislation paving the way for police-free schools. And what's interesting to me is that, how do we lose focus? Why didn't we just think of that from the beginning and saying, hey, what's the value in having school resource officers, right? And so here's a novel idea, right? How about counselors and not cops? And how about really using the experts that have that, right? And so these are some of the things that we can look to do, is to end the police presence, or if we have police presence, restrict the role of law enforcement. But as I mentioned, I've had partners, or I've had friends who are SROs who said to me, Sam, even though we have a memorandum of agreement or a memorandum of understanding, we still get called these things that are really school-related misbehavior. There's no criminal conduct, and most police officers will tell you that I'm not going to arrest a kid for a pushing, shoving match. That's just not going to be. Now, if they brought in a weapon, or there was serious bodily injury, or there was some serious credible threats, those are the kinds of things that we're going to be arresting you for. But the majority of the calls that they were getting, as I said, was for aberrant behavior. How about this as a novel idea? Reallocating the funding that we use to have cops in the schools and redirecting that to mental and behavioral health programs. The true experts, right, that can handle these behavioral issues and things that occur on a daily basis. How about trying to figure out ways that we can create safe school environments through positive climates, through restorative justice measures? So in line with that, as you read the data, as you read articles, as you read what can be done, is that, again, you want to invest in community intervention workers. And what do we mean by that? Well, behavior technicians, behavior interventionists, right? Restorative justice coordinators, counselors, support staff. And you want to do this in a way that you're sort of responding to the root cause of the conflict, right? A lot of these kids come with a lot of needs, right? Social and emotional needs. A lot of these kids may be coming from single family households. They may be coming from families that there's not a square meal, right? There's a lot of things that contribute to that. Now, are we suggesting that we make teachers social workers, or we make school resource officers social workers? No, but what we are saying is that we need to have experts that can deal with this type of disruptive behavior, and that we seek to address that, not criminalize that behavior. And I think we necessarily need to look at this to respond, right, to the individual student's needs. And I think one thing I'm mindful of is that other cities, other states have done or have engaged in creative work in terms of trying to sort of address this, in terms of trying to set the stage. I find that in my short time, well, I was born and raised in Connecticut, but my short time working there, less than 2 years, that I find that at least there's a stronger recognition. Connecticut still has its problems too, but at least there's a stronger recognition in trying to sort of level the playing field in terms of trying to be more proactive in what we do. And so I've looked at school policies, or I've looked at schools code of conduct where they've embedded within there that comes out and straight, you know, they're pretty clear and just says, hey, schools should be minimizing the use of out of school suspension. We should be reducing the referrals for expulsion. We should be referring less cases to law enforcement, that it's written and that it's a sort of a guiding principle that this what we should be doing. And now speaking more to people with social work degrees and education, I mean, there's science that talks about positive behavior interventions and supports, and the use of scientifically research-based methods to try to address some of the root causes of a lot of these problems. And so the goal, in my estimation, should be, one, we have the environment that we need to educate our students. Two is that we're doing everything necessary to divert young people from being subjected to harsh school discipline, being subjected to the juvenile justice system, and really make those arrests or have that interventions when in the absolute cases that are necessary. Another thing that I think other states do that it's worthy of mentioning, and I know Pennsylvania does it, I don't think we do it enough, is looking at restorative justice practices. And when we talk about restorative justice, what are we talking about? We're talking about sort of a problem-solving intervention, a way that we can look at this that targets the root of the problem, right? Not let's punish this kid, let's penalize this kid. And as I said, I've spoken to many school resource officers, and some have said, no, Sam, if I get called, the kid's gonna get arrested, win, lose, or draw. That's their policy. We get called to the school, someone's going to get arrested. And I've also had some, like I said, who've been more fair-minded, more level-headed, and say, hey, Sam, you know what? If they call me and it's a pushing, shoving match, I'm not going to arrest for that. I mean, that's kind of the behavior you would expect in adolescents and juveniles and teenagers, right? And so when I looked at the Pennsylvania website, I mean, the numbers are small within each school, within each district. But when you total them up, it's a staggering number of kids that we're arresting in elementary school, middle school, high school. And so we really have to look at root causes. And I think when you look at some sort of positive behavioral intervention, when you look at restorative justice that looks at the whole, you bring in the kid and say, hey, you did this, and you have sort of the student and the victim. You have you talk about the overarching problem and the need to repair that harm. And how do we sort of make that connection? How can we use that as a learning tool to teach these kids to change their behavior, to reinforce and maximize the appropriate conduct that they should be exhibiting, right? And so for many of us, it's a tough job. I know, as I said, this has been my perspective. I've been there as an advocate, and I firmly believe in what I say. I think that I've been in there in the trenches, representing kids, confronting school teachers, school administrators. And I'm not saying all school teachers are bad. I'm not saying that of the number of teachers we have that they're all bad. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the data speaks to why it may be that we have tension, that we have some stereotyping, that we have some racism sort of percolating its way up, or some discrimination. And the sad thing is that many of you know that this is in the news daily. And this is something, as I said, I would expect to see more of this happening in the 60s and 70s. But this happening in 2021 is just unacceptable. And for me, I don't want to sort of just, leave on a gloom and doom mark. But as I said, I've been trying to suggest ways in which we can see things differently, do things differently. And so on this last slide, I've sort of pointed out to some of the obvious, some of the things that we've talked about, and some of these I've actually seen our executive director underscore in some of his reach outs and some of the things he's been engaging with the community, right? So how about that we genuinely recruit, hire, retain more diverse teachers and staff? How about we look to changing the curriculum to be more diverse, having more holistic approach about history, where we came from and where we are, which includes everyone, right? How do we embed and implement, I would argue, continuous unconscious bias trainings with administrators, teachers, and SROs, right? And that we embed and we institute some of these restorative justice approaches, right? And we stay away or stay clear from just penalizing and punishing, and really taking a really good look at what's happening in our school systems, right? I think making the diversity inclusion plans available to the public, to the extent that we're making change and we're making reforms and we're changing policies, that we let the public know that we're doing such things, right? And probably just as important, having the forum for students to come forward, which is critically important. I think it's something that our executive director has always underscored, is that students who are being marginalized, who are being mistreated, who are being straight up discriminated, need to feel that they can go to someone who's going to listen. They're going to go to someone who's going to follow through and take the necessary steps to remediate and eliminate what's going on. And so, in wrapping up, we've saliently hit on sort of some of these issues. How do we combat racism? Well, I told you of what I think is a bad combination. We've talked about some of the real policy and practical solutions, right? And how about this as a swing of the pendulum, right? How about we start reinvesting in what we do? How about we stop bringing in as many cops as we have, and let's start really making a concerted effort to use that money for experts. It's difficult. I mean, I've had cops say to me, you don't see my response to this. I don't have a social work background. I'm not, we have, small trainings and de-escalation, different things. But when I'm called to the school, I'm called there to do a job. And that's inescapable. We need to sort of understand and appreciate that. So I want to end by saying, I think we can do what's necessary. I think oftentimes we need to sort of recalibrate, refocus on what we're doing. And again, education is a big area in Pennsylvania. And we're not, I'm not talking about other issues that we know are problems within the educational system. So I wanted to hone in essentially on two key role models and key players in the educational system, and really looking at that through a racial justice lens. And so I want to end by saying thank you so much for participating in this. I apologize to those who weren't able to hear the audios. I will make sure that Laura gets a copy to those who want to hear it, and you can hopefully be able to play the video. I think it's worth watching. I think they're heartfelt videos, and I think they're videos that really are troubling for a lot of us to see. And with that, I want to thank the executive director for giving me the opportunity to participate in this lunch and learn. I want to thank Tamika. I want to thank Laura. And I'll thank all those others that have helped me to bring this presentation together. And with that, I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chief Counsel. For those who are on this broadcast and you're not a part of the PHRC network, if you would like a copy of the presentation, I've put my email address in the chat. It is thatcher, so it looks like Thatcher, like Margaret, at pa.gov. We will send you a copy of the presentation because many have asked for it. There's been so much good information in there. We would like for you to get that. Thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us. While we still have you on, Chief Counsel, will you accept any questions?
Sure, and I can answer them. I will.
Do we have any questions in the chat? So we had there has been some robust discussion. The staff has been going back and forth, and some of our community advocates have been chiming in. So we've been talking about the challenge that teachers have between kids who misbehave or act out, and how sometimes they are physically accosted by students. But so where is the line? We talk about, well, self-defense, school resource officers, do they know karate? Can they defend themselves against the students? But what about arming themselves with information and knowledge so that they can disarm the students before it becomes necessary to intervene in a physical manner? Like, why is it, my question is, why is it that physical violence against students is always our first line of defense?
Well, regrettably, it shouldn't be. And I think what happens is that we kind of get, again, a confounding, a mixture of sort of blurring that line, right? So law enforcement officers, particularly SROs, I think they receive, in some states, I think Pennsylvania, they receive some training on de-escalation and cultural competence and things that they should be aware of. So when they're going into these situations, I think the last thing they should be engaged in is really the sort of the physical, trying to detain a youngster. Again, there may be circumstances in which that is warranted, but in most situations, if you get a student who's not responding, who's not following through, it should not be the law enforcement sort of taking the reins on that and say, well, you better get out of the seat or you're going to be arrested, as we've seen. And Tamika, you shared a video with me where this young student is then, body slammed onto the floor, and it becomes a spectacle and it causes a lot of problems. I think there should be duty experts, right? A social worker on staff, a behavioral tech. Those types of people should be really the first responders. It shouldn't be law enforcement, and it shouldn't be school resource officers, because in the end, I don't care what you label them. A cop's a cop, right? I mean, he or she's been trained to do a certain job, and that I expect them to do that job. And so oftentimes it's that difficulty that blurs the line.
I think another issue that we face here at PHRC and what we're looking at in our cases, and this is so important because we have our educational team on and our investigators. So we're looking at educational equity, and we're looking at, what is the word? How we are applying the law, and are we doing it proportionally? So when you have Johnny misbehaving in the school versus Jamal or Jayante misbehaving in the school, are we uniformly calling resource officers? Are they uniformly coming into the classroom? Are they uniformly picking up kids and throwing them across the room? And that's some of the issue. Like, we're not saying that we want kids to be misbehaving or acting out physically against teachers by any means, or that teachers should not have any recourse against that. The concern, like so many other things that we're seeing in our society, is that how we are implementing the discipline that is done, that's being meted out among students. So what's basic school misbehavior for some is graduating to the level of criminal offenses for others, and that is what is fueling this school to prison pipeline. And I can just point only to the example of that shooter that we just had in Atlanta the other day. We have another incident of a person who is armed, dangerous, has killed 8 people, but he was apprehended without incident and without violence. Nobody saw fit to shoot him. And so the justifications that we use a lot of times when we're talking about Black and brown offenders is, oh, well, they were scary, they were armed, they were violent. But we don't see that same level of force being used against race white offenders, be it in a school setting or out on the street when they're inflicting criminal violence on other people. So that's something that's worth talking about, and something that I think that we have to consider in our case situations, not just how bad the kid is and the parents who are involved somehow.
No, and that's a worthy point. I think that's a worthy point, Tamika. It's true. I think here's where you have sort of implicit bias trainings in the way teachers and law enforcement, all of us approach kids of color, right? So I can't explain why these things continue to happen and why there's still racial animus or discrimination that occurs. But the reality is that how we approach those, how we train people. So it may be a question of having to, keep drumming the same beat and having the same training and saying, hey, we need to stop the way, you're right, it should be uniform. If we're going to respond a certain way, it should be responding. That's the way you would respond to any student, white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, doesn't matter, right? But those are the kind of things I think we need to have a lot of work on.
Sam,
Right.
This is Raquel.
Hi, Raquel.
How are you? One of the things that we were talking about in the education committee this morning was the fact that I brought out the fact that, is the curriculum relevant to all students?
Correct.
The same curriculum, is it relevant to all students? And the revision of the curriculum is of paramount importance, because another question that I keep asking is, are we spending too much time in academics and not enough time on the personal side of the students that we teach? I remember when I was an administrator, one of the things that I told my teacher was, never start teaching as soon as the students come in. Give them at least 10 minutes to talk about what experiences they had the night before, how was their life, you don't know what happened to these students during the night. Give them an opportunity to get things out of their mind. Then they'll be ready to start learning. But as soon as they come in, you put the book in front of them, and it's like there's no personal feeling for the students. and the students sense it and they carry that with them. And of course, they're going to be ramming and create discipline problems because we are not paying enough attention to our students as human beings.
That's a very good point, Dr. Yanks. And all I can say is I wish we had more administrators and teachers like you, but I think that's the problem. I think that's the root problem that I've been trying to highlight, that we need more educators that can think out of the box, can be more innovative. And what you said about changing the curriculum, I think that's really the heart of a lot of these problems and issues. I think if we can put our hands around those types of things, I think, the system or, this mistreatment should be able to equalize or get better.
This morning I was speaking to somebody from a school district who said to me, we are horrified because one of the things that the PDE and the federal government is saying that we must test the students as soon as they come back to school. And I couldn't believe that I heard that. I said, of course, that's exactly what they should be doing. How do you know where the students are at if you don't test them? I said, the testing is perfect. The timing is what you need to look at. Are you going to test them the first day of school, or are you going to give them a couple of days to acclimate, have some exciting activities, the welcoming activities to come back to school and so on, and then the testing? But how can you start teaching students without testing them? To me, it's incredible that anybody would think about start teaching without testing the students after being out of the school for a year, and you don't know how much they have achieved or how much they have missed. So, it's just, I don't know, people just don't think.
And thank you for that, Dr. Yanks. You're not going to get any complaints from me.
Hey, Sam, great presentation. I often used to talk to my kids as they were going through school, because I grew up with my grandmother, so I was alone and very attracted to the streets and some behaviors that I won't go into. But I can't imagine what it would have been for me to go to school and the first thing I see is the police presence, especially being that kid kind of growing up inner city, and what it would have done to my psyche, and would it have pushed me closer to the edge, because members of my family believe that I was probably going to end up in jail. You know what I mean? There was already that push. And so for me, I think, and so I say that because I would do a check-in with my kids. Adrian, when he went to school, no police presence, right? My oldest, no police presence. Alex, when he started going to school, police presence. Diego, when he started going to school in Tampa, the first thing he saw was a kid being arrested and taken into a cruiser in front of the school. This is the day I'm registering him in that school. So I can't imagine what that does to the kids. So I'm a big proponent of restorative justice, of using the local mediation centers and those people, those professionals to come in. This idea of having police there, and then the thing is that it's not uniform. You go into some inner city schools, it's like going into a jail, right? You're getting frisked, you gotta show empty your purse if you're a female, or go through the metal detector, you talk through a glass to the administrators, and then some other ones just have the metal detector and that's it, and you go straight in to the halls. So there's no uniformity. And so there is a disparate impact in how severe these measures are in communities of color versus everyone else. Same thing is happening in housing, because if you look at a multi-family housing unit in those areas, it's the same thing. You have signs that say this area is being surveilled 24 hours a day. There's a roving patrol, and yet you have the same housing unit owned by the same housing provider somewhere else that is not an inner city, and none of those measures are taken. And so this is not just during school, this is a 24-hour cycle. Anyway, that's.
Yeah, I just wanted to step in. I know that we're getting ready to conclude, and Adrian, everything that he just verbalized is absolutely on point. Phenomenal presentation, high level, very needed, very intentional for the moment we find ourselves in. more than just kudos to you, Sam, just a sincere thanks for bringing your primary, secondary experiences and your expertise to the context. Want to also say that this is part and parcel of everything that Dr. Yanks has been talking about for about 35 years of her career, is how we other minorities, and specifically how we track them. But I don't want to underscore the point that Tamika brought, which is on the white side of the color line, we tend to provide, and I'll use the social work term, a biopsychosocial assessment. The chief of police yesterday said about the white killer who engaged in a form of domestic terrorism that he was having a bad day. We've heard the same narratives with regards to Dylan Ruth. We've heard the same narratives with regards to Kyle Rittenhouse, Jeffrey Dahmer, the Branch Davidians, David Koresh, the Unabomber, Ted Bundy, Timothy McVeigh, and the list is exhaustive. And it's the same thing in schools where you have white youth and others who act out and they're given maybe a timeout or in-house suspension. Our Hispanic youth, our Black youth, and oftentimes youth of color are arrested. They're put in on-home suspensions, they're expelled. And I don't want to lose the point that you mentioned, Sam, with regards to being pushed out. If my teacher doesn't look like you, it doesn't look like Dr. Yanks, doesn't look like Tamika, doesn't look like Adrian and multiple others, it's not drop out. I may be pushed out because someone is not recognizing my humanity. But I'm also kind of really kind of alarmed, and I'll stop on this note, with some of the data that was in the chat, which for me shows me as the ED that we have a lot of work that we have to do in-house at PHRC with regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and unconscious bias training, that we tend to sometimes lean when we're talking about minority students about, family structures and things of that nature, absent a void of looking at the totality of things. And I think it's very important for us to look at the totality of things. The first educators certainly are families, but unless you have been marginalized and oppressed against the thumb, structurally and systemically with racism, we don't know what it means to be a minority family member, giving birth to kids trying to survive under the pressure of all these things that we see. Similar to what's happening with the Asian spas. There's a deeper story to why those Asian women are working in that particular economy. With us and our values and our privileged status, we sometimes can say, well, why would the parent allow the child to go outside at 11 o'clock at night and go to the corner store, not knowing that maybe that parent is an essential worker, got up, was showering, and told the child, go get me some Chinese food so I can eat something on my way to work. And so we don't question on the other side of the color line oftentimes, but yet we have situations out Columbine and things of that nature. So I'll end by simply saying, I appreciate a lot of the stuff that was in the chat from our staff, but there are some things that we need to kind of structure, because on one level, if we're saying these type of things in the chat and missing the point of what you're saying, then that can correlate over into the way we're engaged in our investigative processes. See, we have to see the humanity of all people and not allow an excuse to emerge for one set of the population vis-a-vis without the other set of the population. And so once again, thank you so much, Sam. And everybody have a great day. And we're looking forward to chopping this up with regards to getting it to the people that we need to get it to, because there's a lot of requests that are coming in. And certainly appreciative that we are a few minutes over. It's 1:15 and we still have 53 engaged people that are on this presentation. So want to thank our ASL interpreter